Welcome to Ask, Fear and Greed, where we take your questions and do our very best to answer them. I'm Michael Thompson, and good afternoon, Sean Aylmer.
Hello, Michael.
Sean, after the success of our first episode of Ask, Fear and Greed, where we answered Nina's, I say we, it was you, answered Nina's question about the income tax reductions and the impact on inflation, we are back to do it again with a fantastic question from John. Are you ready for this, Sean?
I'm ready for it.
All right. Look, John wants to know. He has a question for us on CPI. He says, how much of it is driven by services versus goods? He says, I see wages still going up and business owners have no choice but to pass these costs on. How does that impact CPI figures? Over to you. I've done my bit.
Great question. So there's no exact answer to it because sometimes goods inflation affects CPI more than services inflation, depends what's going up. Maybe we need a couple of definitions up front. Goods inflation, basically it's the stuff that you buy and bring home, TV, new clothes, supermarket food, that sort of stuff. Services inflation is the stuff you buy but you don't bring home. Rent, that's about 13% of services inflation in that CPI basket. Insurance and financial services, holiday travel, medical's in there, education's in there. Restaurant meals is another one. So you buy it but you don't bring it home. Well, you probably do because you probably put it in a takeaway container if it's not completed. But you get the point. Goods you bring home, services you don't.
Was it Michelle Bullock, the RBA governor, who was asked this question as well, the difference between the two at the press conference? And she said, what was it? If you can drop it on your foot, it's goods. I'm like, that's a good way to remember it. Very simple.
Yeah. No. Well, the way I think of it is if you bring it home, yep. If you don't, services. In the short term, when COVID finished and people had all this money in their bank accounts, they went and spent it on stuff like clothes and dishwashers. Well, I don't know about dishwashers, TVs, you know what I mean, white goods, all that sort of stuff. They couldn't travel to begin with, so they spent a lot of it on goods. Goods inflation took off. After a year or 2 years, we ended up having a housing crisis, so that pushed rents higher. People took more holidays, which is actually a service. You can't bring a holiday home, so that's a service. Insurance premiums rose. Now, a lot of that was due to climate change and stuff like that. Services inflation took off after goods inflation. But it takes more time to get in services inflation down. Many services are non-negotiable. So interest rates rise, you think, I haven't got as much money. You can put off buying a new TV, but you can't really put off paying the rent. So it's much harder to get services inflation lower than it is to get goods inflation. And it is fair to say now that goods inflation is under control, but services inflation isn't. Something else interesting. Services inflation tends to run in line with wages growth. And we've seen higher wages in Australia. As a result, we've seen higher services inflation. This is a global trend, not just in Australian. So that means that you can't actually say how much of the CPI is services, how much is goods, because it just depends on when it's running. At the moment, services inflation is running most. Now, Michael, can you give me the second part of the question? I've gone off and I've been very excited about this, but I can't quite remember what the second part of the question was. It's about wages.
Yes, he goes that I see wages going up and business owners have no choice but to pass these costs on. How does that impact CPI figures?
I love the fact that he said, I see wages going up and up and up. The fact that he says see is really, really important. The Reserve Bank talks about inflation expectations. They are paranoid that inflation expectations will run wild. Why are we worried about that? If I go to work and I'm negotiating a wage rise, and I think inflation, there's lots of inflation out there, then I don't want a 3% rise, I want a 5% rise. If I'm a business, running a business, and someone's negotiating with me, I know they're going to ask for 5% because inflation's rampant out there. They're not going to ask for 3%. I also know that I can actually put up the cost of my goods by 5%, not 3%, because people expect inflation to be out there. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy where inflation expectations leads to inflation. If you can cut inflation expectations, people won't see that prices are increasing or see that wages are increasing. They'll just experience what is actually happening. So that's why that whole inflation expectation thing is so, so important. If the Reserve Bank can use interest rates to cut inflation expectations, people won't be asking for 5%, they'll be asking for 3%. Retailers won't be pushing up the price of goods by 5%, they'll be pushing it up by 2 or 3%. And that actually helps defeat inflation.
Inflation expectation sounds like an 80s kind of progressive rock band, don't you think?
I hadn't thought that until this very moment.
Yeah. I think you've answered John's. Look, I'm biased because I'm here with you, and I have learned something. I think you've answered John's question.
Well, I hope so, John. I'm very enthusiastic about it, so maybe that's why you think I have answered the question. John, come right back at us if I haven't, but I think I've done an okay job.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John, for your question. And remember, if you've got something you'd like to know, then please send it through. Jump onto LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. You can find us at Fear and Greed Podcast on any of those platforms, or just head along to fearandgreed.com.au and pop your question in there, and we will get to it. And Sean, I mean, that's 2 from 2 now.
Thank
John,
you.
I know we're marking our own homework here, but I'm going to say A+.
Thank you very much.
So remember to hit follow on the podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Ask Fear and Greed.